Dorothy Cooper had always believed that the most dangerous secrets were hidden in plain sight. At 48, she had spent 12 years cleaning the executive floors of the Meridian Tower in downtown Chicago, moving through glass-walled offices like a ghost while powerful people discussed billion-dollar deals and political strategies around her. But on a foggy November evening in 2023, while emptying a wastebasket in the corner office of Henderson Global Consulting, Dorothy discovered something that would transform her from an invisible cleaning lady into the woman who prevented the most devastating political assassinations in modern history. The folder she pulled from the trash wasn't supposed to be there. Marked TRINITY PROTOCOL, eyes only, it contained detailed surveillance photos, architectural blueprints, and timeline schedules for 3 separate locations: the World Economic Forum in Switzerland, the G7 Summit in Japan, and the United Nations Security Council session in New York. But it wasn't the locations that made Dorothy's blood run cold. It was the red X marks drawn over the faces of the British Prime Minister, the German Chancellor, and the President of France. 3 world leaders, 3 assassination targets. And she was the only person who knew. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Dorothy Cooper had perfected the art of being invisible long before she understood its value. Standing barely 5 feet tall with graying brown hair always pulled back into a practical bun, she moved through the gleaming corridors of Meridian Tower with the quiet efficiency of someone who had learned that being noticed in her line of work was rarely a good thing. Her uniform, a simple navy blue dress with the Henderson Global Consulting logo embroidered on the pocket, was as unremarkable as she intended it to be. The 48th floor of Meridian Tower housed one of Chicago's most prestigious consulting firms, where former government officials, retired intelligence operatives, and corporate executives advised multinational corporations on everything from market strategies to geopolitical risks. Dorothy had been cleaning these offices since 2011, arriving each evening at 6 p.m. after the daytime staff had gone home, working through the night to ensure everything was spotless for the next day's meetings. Henderson Global wasn't just any consulting firm. Founded by Marcus Henderson, a former deputy director of the CIA, the company specialized in what they called strategic risk assessment for Fortune 500 companies operating in volatile regions. Their client list read like a who's who of global power: oil companies with operations in unstable countries, defense contractors navigating international regulations, and pharmaceutical giants dealing with government bureaucracies worldwide. Dorothy knew the routine by heart. She would start with the reception area, dusting the mahogany surfaces and polishing the brass nameplate that read Henderson Global Consulting, navigating tomorrow's challenges today. Then she would work her way through the maze of offices, each one belonging to a consultant who charged more per hour than Dorothy made in a month. The junior associates' offices were cluttered with case files and energy drink cans. The senior partners' offices were pristine, with expensive artwork and photographs, showing them shaking hands with politicians and business leaders. But it was the executive suite that required the most careful attention. Marcus Henderson's corner office was a testament to power and influence, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering a commanding view of Lake Michigan and walls lined with photographs of Henderson alongside presidents, senators, and foreign dignitaries. The office's centerpiece was a massive oak desk where Henderson conducted meetings that, Dorothy had learned over the years, often determined the fate of entire industries. Dorothy had developed her own system for cleaning the executive offices. She would start with the conference room, where Henderson held his most sensitive meetings. The room's walls were lined with monitors that could display satellite feeds, financial data, and intelligence reports from around the world. She would carefully dust each screen, noting the occasional forgotten document or classified folder that had been left behind. Years of cleaning had taught her to recognize the hierarchy of importance in these documents. The more classified or confidential stamps a paper had, the more carefully she handled it. The adjacent offices belonged to Henderson's inner circle. David Morrison, the former National Security Advisor who handled government relations. Sarah Chun, an ex-CIA analyst who specialized in international threat assessment. And Robert Kessler, a retired Army colonel who managed what the company euphemistically called Special Operations Consulting. Each of these offices contained filing cabinets with combination locks, secure phones that required special clearance to use, and computers that were never left unattended. What struck Dorothy most about working in this environment was how completely she was ignored. These were people who had spent careers being suspicious of everyone, analyzing threats and protecting classified information. Yet when she entered their offices with her cleaning cart, they would continue their phone calls, leave sensitive documents on their desks, and discuss confidential matters as if she weren't there. It was as if her uniform made her invisible, her presence so mundane that their highly trained security awareness simply didn't register her as a potential threat. The years, Dorothy had developed what she thought of as selective hearing. She would focus on her cleaning tasks while filtering out the conversations around her, understanding instinctively that knowledge of her clients' business affairs could be dangerous. She had overheard discussions about corporate espionage, government coups, and military interventions, but she had always managed to convince herself that these were just theoretical exercises, academic discussions about events happening far away from her small world. Dorothy's personal life was as unremarkable as her professional one. She lived in a modest apartment in Rogers Park, a neighborhood that had been slowly gentrifying around her for the past decade. Her husband Thomas worked as a mechanic at a local auto shop, and their daughter Jessica was a sophomore at Northwestern University studying international relations. Jessica had inherited her mother's quiet intelligence and her father's mechanical aptitude, but she also possessed an idealism that sometimes worried Dorothy. The girl believed that the world could be changed by people who were willing to stand up for what was right, a notion that Dorothy found both admirable and naive. The Cooper family lived paycheck to paycheck, with Dorothy's evening cleaning job providing the extra income that made Jessica's college education possible. They weren't poor, but they weren't wealthy either. They occupied that invisible middle ground where people worked hard, paid their taxes, and hoped that their children would have better opportunities than they had. Dorothy took pride in her work, even if it was work that others might consider menial. She believed that every job had dignity if it was done honestly and well. Her relationship with the people whose offices she cleaned was professionally cordial but personally distant. Henderson would nod politely when he encountered her in the hallway. Morrison would offer a brief good evening when he worked late, and Chun would smile kindly when she saw Dorothy restocking the supply closet. But Dorothy understood that she was part of the building's infrastructure, as essential and invisible as the heating system or the elevator maintenance. This invisibility had served her well for over a decade. She had witnessed corporate executives celebrating deals that would cost thousands of jobs, watched government officials discuss military interventions that would destabilize entire regions, and seen intelligence operatives plan operations that would topple foreign governments. But she had always managed to maintain the psychological distance necessary to do her job without becoming emotionally involved in the consequences of what she observed. The night of November 15, 2023, started like any other. Dorothy arrived at Meridian Tower at her usual time, badged through the security turnstile with her employee ID, and took the elevator to the 48th floor. The Henderson Global offices were empty except for the night security guard who was stationed in the lobby 48 floors below. Dorothy appreciated the solitude. It allowed her to work efficiently without having to navigate around busy executives or worry about disrupting important meetings. She began her routine in the reception area, working her way systematically through the junior associate's offices before moving to the senior partner's wing. Everything seemed normal until she reached the executive suite. Marcus Henderson's office, usually meticulously organized, showed signs of hasty departure. Papers were scattered across his desk, file drawers had been left partially open, and the secure phone's handset was slightly askew, as if someone had hung up quickly. As Dorothy began straightening the desk, she noticed that the normally empty wastebasket beside Henderson's chair was filled with shredded documents. This was unusual. Sensitive documents were typically disposed of through a specialized service that guaranteed complete destruction. But someone had been in such a hurry that they had simply fed documents through the office shredder and dumped the remains in the regular trash. Most of the shredded material was beyond recognition, but as Dorothy emptied the wastebasket, she noticed a manila folder that had somehow escaped the shredding process. It had been crumpled and thrown into the trash intact, as if whoever had been destroying documents had missed it in their haste. The folder was marked with red stamps reading TRINITY PROTOCOL Eyes Only and classified, compartmented. Dorothy's first instinct was to put the folder back in the trash and continue with her cleaning. She had learned over the years that curiosity about her client's business was a luxury she couldn't afford. But something about the folder's markings troubled her. She had seen thousands of classified documents during her years at Henderson Global, but she had never seen anything marked TRINITY Protocol. The designation was unfamiliar, and the fact that it had been hastily discarded rather than properly destroyed suggested that it contained information someone was desperate to hide. Against her better judgment, Dorothy opened the folder. What she found inside would haunt her for the rest of her life and transform her from an invisible cleaning lady into the woman who would prevent the most devastating political assassinations in modern history. The folder contained detailed surveillance, photographs, architectural blueprints, and operational timelines for 3 separate locations: the World Economic Forum in Davos, Switzerland, the G7 Summit in Hiroshima, Japan, and the United Nations Security Council session in New York City. But it wasn't the locations that made Dorothy's blood run cold. It was the red X marks drawn over the faces of 3 world leaders in the surveillance. Photographs. The British Prime Minister, photographed entering the World Economic Forum. The German Chancellor, captured in a telephoto shot at the G7 Summit. The President of France, shown walking into the UN building. 3 of the world's most powerful leaders, each marked for death. As Dorothy stared at the photographs, she realized she was looking at evidence of the most ambitious assassination plot in modern history. Someone was planning to kill 3 world leaders at 3 separate international summits, and they were using Henderson Global Consulting as their operational headquarters. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Dorothy's hands trembled as she spread the contents of the folder across Henderson's mahogany desk. The documents were more extensive than she had initially realized. Each assassination target had their own detailed dossier complete with security protocols, travel itineraries, and what appeared to be insider intelligence about their protective details. The first dossier focused on British Prime Minister Victoria Ashworth. The surveillance photos showed her arriving at the World Economic Forum in Davos, but what chilled Dorothy was the level of detail in the accompanying documents. Someone had obtained the Prime Minister's exact schedule, including private meetings that weren't part of the public agenda. There were floor plans of the Davos Congress Center with specific rooms marked, photographs of the Prime Minister's security detail with names and background information, and most disturbing of all, a detailed analysis of what the document called vulnerability windows, moments when the Prime Minister would be exposed during transitions between meetings. The second dossier was even more comprehensive. German Chancellor Klaus Weber's assassination plan revolved around the G7 summit in Hiroshima. The documents included not only his official schedule, but also intelligence about his personal habits, his morning run route, his preference for stepping onto balconies for phone calls, and his tendency to arrive early to meetings. Someone had been studying the Chancellor's behavior patterns for months, identifying the precise moments when he would be most vulnerable to attack. The third dossier made Dorothy's heart race. French President Marie Dubois, scheduled to address the UN Security Council in New York City, less than 200 miles from where Dorothy now sat. The assassination plan was scheduled for December 8th, just 3 weeks away. The documents showed detailed surveillance of the UN building, with particular attention to the French president's typical entry routes and security checkpoints. There were photographs of UN security personnel, building blueprints highlighting structural weaknesses, and what appeared to be a complete infiltration plan for the building. As Dorothy examined the documents more closely, she began to understand the sophistication of the operation. This wasn't the work of a lone assassin or even a small terrorist cell. The level of intelligence gathering, the coordination across multiple countries, and the detailed knowledge of each target's security arrangements suggested a well-funded, professionally organized conspiracy with resources that rivaled those of nation-states. Each dossier contained a section marked Operational Assets, which listed individuals who would be involved in the assassination attempts. The names were coded, but Dorothy could see that the operation involved dozens of people across multiple countries. There were surveillance assets who had been monitoring the targets for months, infiltration assets who had gained access to secure locations, and operational assets who would carry out the actual assassinations. What troubled Dorothy most was the evidence of high-level infiltration within the security services protecting these world leaders. The documents contained detailed information about security protocols that should have been known only to the inner circles of each leader's protective detail. Someone with access to the highest levels of international security had been feeding information to the assassination plotters. That the operational timelines were equally disturbing. The World Economic Forum attack was scheduled for January 15, 2024. The G7 summit assassination was planned for March 22nd. The UN Security Council attack, the one targeting the French president, was set for December 8th, just 3 weeks away. The conspirators weren't planning a single dramatic event. They were orchestrating a campaign of terror that would unfold over several months. Each assassination designed to destabilize international relations and throw the global political order into chaos. Dorothy found herself studying a document titled Strategic Objectives, which outlined the expected consequences of the assassination campaign. The conspirators anticipated that the death of 3 major European leaders would trigger a constitutional crisis in each country, potentially leading to political instability, economic collapse, and the rise of extremist movements. The document suggested that certain individuals and organizations were positioned to benefit from this chaos, though their identities were referenced only through coded designations. As she read deeper into the materials, Dorothy discovered that Henderson Global Consulting was more than just a front for the operation. It was the coordination center. The company's legitimate business relationships with governments and corporations around the world provided perfect cover for the intelligence gathering and logistical planning required for such a complex conspiracy. Marcus Henderson's connections to former intelligence officials gave the conspirators access to classified information and operational expertise that would have been impossible to obtain through normal channels. The documents revealed that Henderson had been recruited by what they called the Syndicate, a shadowy organization that appeared to be composed of wealthy individuals, corporate executives, and rogue intelligence operatives who shared a common interest in destabilizing the current international order. The Syndicate's membership was never explicitly identified, but references throughout the documents suggested that they controlled significant financial resources and had infiltrated intelligence agencies and government institutions across multiple countries. Dorothy's attention was drawn to a series of financial documents that showed massive money transfers to accounts in Switzerland, the Cayman Islands, and Singapore. The amounts were staggering. Over $500 million had been moved through various shell companies and offshore accounts to fund the operation. The money had been used to pay bribes, purchase specialized equipment, and maintain surveillance teams in multiple countries. The financial trail suggested that the syndicate had been planning this operation for years, slowly building the infrastructure necessary to carry out simultaneous assassinations across 3 continents. One document that particularly caught her attention was titled Contingency Protocols. It outlined what would happen if any part of the operation was compromised, or if any of the assassination attempts failed. The conspirators had planned for multiple scenarios, including the possibility that one or more of the targets might survive the initial attempts on their lives. In such cases, the document described secondary elimination protocols that would involve more direct and public attacks designed to send a message to other world leaders about the consequences of opposing the syndicate's interests. The contingency protocols also addressed the possibility of exposure. If the operation was discovered before the assassinations could be carried out, the syndicate had prepared what they called scorched earth protocols. These involved eliminating anyone who might have knowledge of the conspiracy, including their own operational assets. Dorothy realized with growing horror that she was now one of those people who possessed dangerous knowledge about the syndicate's plans. As she continued reading, Dorothy discovered that Henderson Global's legitimate consulting work had been used to gather intelligence on potential targets for years. The company's contracts with international organizations, government agencies, and multinational corporations had provided access to classified information about the security arrangements for world leaders, the operational procedures of intelligence agencies, and the financial systems that could be disrupted to maximize the impact of the assassinations. The documents showed that Henderson had been particularly skilled at exploiting his former colleagues' trust. His status as a former deputy director of the CIA gave him access to current intelligence officers who would share information with him under the assumption that he was conducting legitimate research for his corporate clients. These officers had unknowingly provided Henderson with detailed intelligence about the security arrangements for international summits, the travel patterns of world leaders, and the operational capabilities of foreign intelligence services. Dorothy found evidence that several other consulting firms and private intelligence companies were involved in the conspiracy. The operation was structured as a network of seemingly independent organizations, each handling different aspects of the assassination campaign. This compartmentalization made it difficult for any single individual to understand the full scope of the operation, while also providing plausible deniability for the participants if any part of the conspiracy was exposed. The sophistication of the operation extended to its communication systems. The conspirators used encrypted messaging services, coded language, and a complex system of dead drops and courier services to coordinate their activities. They had clearly studied how intelligence agencies communicate and had adopted similar security measures to protect their own operations. The documents showed that they had even recruited former intelligence operatives who specialized in counterintelligence to help them avoid detection by law enforcement agencies. As Dorothy absorbed the full implications of what she had discovered, she began to understand that she was looking at evidence of the most ambitious terrorist conspiracy in modern history. The syndicate wasn't just planning to assassinate 3 world leaders, they were planning to reshape the global political order by eliminating the leaders who stood in their way. The chaos that would follow these assassinations would create opportunities for their allies to seize power and implement policies that would benefit their financial and political interests. The weight of her discovery began to sink in. Dorothy Cooper, A cleaning lady from Rogers Park, who had never traveled outside the United States, had stumbled upon a conspiracy that threatened to plunge the world into chaos. She was holding in her hands evidence that could prevent the deaths of 3 world leaders and expose a criminal network that had infiltrated the highest levels of international politics and intelligence services. But as she sat in Henderson's office, surrounded by the evidence of this massive conspiracy, Dorothy realized that her problems were just beginning. The conspirators had killed to protect their secret before, and they wouldn't hesitate to kill again if they discovered that their plans had been exposed. She was no longer just an invisible cleaning lady. She was the only person who knew about the TRINITY Protocol, and that knowledge had made her one of the most dangerous people in the world. Dorothy's mind raced as she carefully photographed each document with her old smartphone, her hands shaking so badly that several shots came out blurred. The cheap phone's camera wasn't designed for covert photography, but it was all she had. Each flash seemed impossibly loud in the silent office, and she found herself glancing toward the door every few seconds, expecting to see Henderson or one of his associates returning unexpectedly. The weight of what she had discovered was crushing. 3 world leaders were going to die unless she could figure out how to stop it. But who could she trust with information this explosive? The documents had shown that the conspiracy reached into intelligence agencies, law enforcement, and government institutions across multiple countries. For all she knew, the FBI agents or police officers she might contact could be working for the syndicate. As she finished photographing the last document, Dorothy faced a terrible dilemma. She needed to put everything back exactly as she had found it, but doing so meant leaving the evidence where the conspirators could destroy it. Yet taking the documents would immediately alert them that their operation had been compromised, potentially accelerating their timeline or triggering those scorched earth protocols she had read about. Dorothy decided on a compromise that she hoped would buy her time. She carefully returned all the documents to the folder, but she folded one corner of a seemingly insignificant financial record in a way that would tell her if the folder had been disturbed. If the conspirators discovered that someone had accessed the documents, they would likely reorganize everything, and the folded corner would be flattened. It was a small detail, but it might give her advance warning if her discovery had been detected. She placed the folder back in the wastebasket exactly as she had found it, then continued with her cleaning routine as if nothing had happened. But everything had changed. As she dusted Henderson's desk, she noticed details that had previously escaped her attention. The secure phone had direct lines to numbers in Switzerland, Singapore, and the Cayman Islands, the same locations mentioned in the financial documents. A seemingly decorative paperweight on his desk bore the inscription, "Veritas through order," a motto that had appeared on several of the syndicate's internal communications. The next few hours were the longest of Dorothy's life. She moved through her cleaning routine mechanically, but her mind was consumed with the knowledge of what was coming. December 8th was only 3 weeks away. French President Marie Dubois would walk into the UN building expecting to address the Security Council about climate change policy, not knowing that she was walking into an assassination plot that had been years in the planning. Dorothy found herself studying the other offices with new eyes. David Morrison's office contained maps of New York City with the UN building highlighted, and his computer screen, which she had never paid attention to before, displayed what appeared to be architectural software. Sarah Chun's desk had printouts of flight schedules from Charles de Gaulle Airport in Paris, and her bookshelf contained surveillance manuals disguised as academic texts on international relations. Robert Kessler's office held equipment catalogs that Dorothy now realized were probably being used to acquire specialized weapons and surveillance gear. As she worked, Dorothy began to understand how the conspiracy had operated undetected for so long. Henderson Global's legitimate business provided perfect cover for activities that would have been suspicious from any other organization. When David Morrison traveled to New York to scout the UN building, he was officially there to meet with corporate clients about security consulting. When Sarah Chun analyzed flight schedules and security protocols, she was supposedly conducting threat assessments for business executives. When Robert Kessler acquired specialized equipment, he was officially purchasing security systems for corporate clients. The genius of the operation was its compartmentalization. Each member of Henderson Global was handling what appeared to be separate, legitimate consulting projects. Only Henderson himself knew that these projects were actually components of a massive assassination conspiracy. Even the junior staff at the firm were unknowingly contributing to the operation by conducting research, preparing reports, and handling logistics that they believed were for paying clients. Dorothy's cleaning routine took her to the secure conference room where she had often seen Henderson meeting with visitors who didn't appear on any official schedule. The room's walls were soundproofed, and it contained communication equipment that could establish encrypted connections to anywhere in the world. As she cleaned the room's massive table, Dorothy noticed indentations in the leather surface where someone had been writing with heavy pressure. She couldn't make out the words, but she could see the outline of what appeared to be dates and location names. The printer in the conference room contained paper with the Henderson Global letterhead, but Dorothy noticed that it also contained blank documents with the letterheads of several other organizations: Meridian Risk Assessment, Global Strategic Consulting, and International Security Solutions. She realized that these were probably front companies used by the syndicate to conduct business that couldn't be traced back to Henderson Global. As Dorothy worked her way through the office complex, she began to notice security cameras that she had never paid attention to before. The cameras were positioned to monitor every entrance and exit, and she realized that her activities tonight were probably being recorded. The thought sent a chill through her. If the conspirators reviewed the security footage, they might notice that she had spent an unusual amount of time in Henderson's office. But Dorothy also realized that her 12 years of perfect routine worked in her favor. The security guards were accustomed to seeing her move through the building at predictable times and in predictable patterns. As long as she maintained her normal routine, there was no reason for anyone to scrutinize the recordings of her activities. The real challenge would come in the days ahead. Dorothy needed time to figure out how to expose the conspiracy without getting herself killed in the process. But she also couldn't allow the French president to walk into an assassination trap 3 weeks from now. The tension between these competing needs was almost unbearable. As she finished her shift and prepared to leave the building, Dorothy made a decision that would define everything that followed. She couldn't go to the authorities, not yet, because she didn't know who to trust. But she could begin her own investigation. She had spent 12 years observing the people involved in this conspiracy. She knew their routines, their habits, and their weaknesses. If anyone could figure out how to expose them safely, it was someone who had been watching them unnoticed for over a decade. The first step was to verify that what she had discovered was real and not some elaborate disinformation campaign or fictional scenario designed to test security protocols. Dorothy had seen enough of Henderson Global's work to know that they sometimes created realistic simulations for training purposes. While the documents she had found seemed authentic, she needed independent confirmation that the assassination plot was real. Dorothy decided to focus initially on the UN Security Council attack, since it was the most imminent threat and the one taking place closest to her location. If she could confirm that the French president was actually scheduled to address the Security Council on December 8th, and if she could verify some of the other details mentioned in the documents, she would know that the conspiracy was real. The next morning, Dorothy did something she had never done before. She called in sick to work. Instead of sleeping after her night shift, she took the train downtown to the Chicago Public Library and spent the day researching everything she could find about the upcoming UN Security Council session. What she discovered confirmed her worst fears. French President Marie Dubois was indeed scheduled to address the Security Council on December Eighth, about France's new climate change initiatives. The session was being promoted as a major diplomatic event with extensive media coverage planned. The French president's schedule, which Dorothy found in diplomatic press releases, matched exactly what she had seen in the assassination documents. Even more disturbing, some of the security arrangements mentioned in the TRINITY Protocol documents were confirmed by news reports about the diplomatic preparations for the session. Dorothy realized that she was looking at evidence of the most sophisticated intelligence operation she could imagine. The syndicate had somehow obtained information that was supposed to be known only to the French president's security detail and the UN's own security apparatus. The level of infiltration required to gather such detailed intelligence was staggering. As she sat in the library, surrounded by printouts of news articles and diplomatic press releases, Dorothy understood that she was completely out of her depth. She was a cleaning lady with a high school education, facing a conspiracy that involved some of the most sophisticated and dangerous people in the world. They had unlimited resources, international connections, and the willingness to kill anyone who threatened their operation. But Dorothy also realized that she had advantages that the conspirators couldn't anticipate. They had dismissed her as insignificant for 12 years, never imagining that the cleaning lady could understand the significance of what she was observing. They had no reason to suspect that she had discovered their secret, and they had no reason to change their behavior as long as they believed their operation remained undetected. Most importantly, Dorothy had something that the conspirators lacked: a moral clarity that made it impossible for her to walk away from what she had discovered. 3 innocent people were going to die unless she found the courage to act. The fact that those people happened to be world leaders made the conspiracy more significant, but it didn't make Dorothy's moral obligation any less clear. As she left the library that afternoon, Dorothy Cooper made a commitment that would transform her from an invisible cleaning lady into one of the most important witnesses in modern history. She was going to expose the TRINITY Protocol, regardless of the personal cost. The only question was how to do it without getting herself and her family killed in the process. Dorothy returned to work the following evening with a knot of anxiety in her stomach. She had spent the day researching methods of anonymous communication and secure document transmission, learning about encrypted email services and digital dead drops from library computers. What she had discovered was both encouraging and terrifying. There were ways to safely transmit sensitive information to authorities, but they required technical expertise she didn't possess, and time she wasn't sure she had. As she badged into Meridian Tower, Dorothy noticed something that made her blood run cold. Marcus Henderson's Bentley was still in the executive parking garage, along with 2 other luxury vehicles she recognized as belonging to David Morrison and Sarah Chun. It was nearly 7 p.m., well past the time when the executive staff normally departed. Either they were working unusually late, or they had discovered that their operation had been compromised. Dorothy's hands trembled as she entered the elevator. She had prepared herself for this possibility, but she hadn't expected it to happen so soon. If the conspirators knew that someone had accessed their documents, her life was in immediate danger. But she also knew that acting suspiciously now would only confirm their suspicions. She had to maintain her normal routine while being prepared to run at the first sign of trouble. The 48th floor was buzzing with activity that Dorothy had never seen during her evening shifts. Several men in expensive suits were moving through the offices, conducting what appeared to be a systematic search of every room. They weren't Henderson Global employees. Their body language and the way they moved through the space suggested they were professional security operatives, possibly former military or intelligence personnel. Dorothy forced herself to remain calm as she wheeled her cleaning cart toward the reception area. One of the operatives glanced at her briefly before returning to his search of the filing cabinets. To him, she was just the cleaning lady, as invisible and harmless as she had always been. But Dorothy could see that they were looking for something specific, and she suspected that something was evidence of who had accessed the TRINITY Protocol documents. As she began her cleaning routine, Dorothy positioned herself where she could observe the activity in Henderson's office. Through the glass walls, she could see Henderson himself directing the search while speaking in urgent tones on his secure phone. His normally composed demeanor had been replaced by barely controlled anxiety, and Dorothy realized that her worst fears were being confirmed. They knew someone had discovered their secret. The search was methodical and professional. The operatives were checking not just for missing documents, but for any sign that someone had been where they shouldn't have been. Dorothy watched with growing dread as one of them examined the wastebasket where she had found the TRINITY Protocol folder. They were looking for fingerprints, displaced items, anything that might indicate unauthorized access. Dorothy's heart nearly stopped when she saw Sarah Chun enter Henderson's office, carrying what appeared to be security camera footage. They were reviewing the recordings from the previous evening, looking for any anomalous behavior that might indicate who had compromised their operation. Dorothy realized she had perhaps an hour, maybe less, before they identified her as the person who had spent too much time in Henderson's office. Working with desperate efficiency, Dorothy began implementing the emergency plan she had developed during her day of research. She moved her cleaning cart to the supply closet, where she had hidden a small bag containing the smartphone with the photographed documents, some cash, and a change of clothes. If she was going to survive the next few hours, she needed to disappear before the conspirators connected her to their security breach. But as Dorothy prepared to leave the building, she overheard a conversation that changed everything. Henderson was speaking to someone on his secure phone, and his words carried clearly through the glass walls of his office. Move up the timeline. If someone knows about Trinity, we can't wait until December. The French president needs to be eliminated within 48 hours. The revelation hit Dorothy like a physical blow. By discovering their conspiracy, she had inadvertently triggered an acceleration of their assassination schedule. Instead of having 3 weeks to expose the plot, she now had less than 2 days. French President Marie Dubois was going to die this weekend unless Dorothy could find a way to warn her. Dorothy's mind raced as she considered her options. She could try to contact the French embassy or the Secret Service, but she had no way to verify that those institutions hadn't been infiltrated by the syndicate. She could attempt to reach out to international media, but convincing journalists that she had stumbled upon evidence of an international assassination conspiracy would take time she didn't have. Most critically, she didn't know the specific details of the accelerated assassination plan, only that it was happening much sooner than originally scheduled. As these thoughts consumed her attention, Dorothy failed to notice that one of the security operatives had been watching her. When she looked up from her cleaning cart, she found herself face to face with a man whose cold eyes suggested he was accustomed to violence. "Excuse me," he said in a voice that was polite but carried an unmistakable threat. "Mr. Henderson would like to speak with you." Dorothy's survival instincts kicked in. She had spent 12 years observing dangerous people, and she knew that this conversation would not end well for her. "Of course," she replied, forcing her voice to remain steady. "Let me just finish with this trash bin." As she bent down to empty the wastebasket, Dorothy palmed the small canister of industrial strength cleaning solvent she always carried, the same substance that had saved her predecessor at Pinnacle Shooting Club years earlier. When the operative moved closer, clearly intending to escort her to Henderson's office, Dorothy acted. She sprayed the cleaning solvent directly into his eyes, causing him to cry out and stumble backward. In the confusion, she grabbed her hidden bag from the supply closet and ran toward the emergency stairwell, knowing that the elevators would be too slow and too easily controlled by the conspirators. Behind her, Dorothy could hear shouting and the sound of feet pounding across the office floor. The emergency alarm began blaring as she pushed through the stairwell door, but she knew the building's security protocols worked in her favor in an emergency. All elevators would shut down, forcing anyone pursuing her to use the stairs as Well, 48 floors had never seemed so far. Dorothy's legs burned as she took the stairs two at a time, driven by adrenaline and the knowledge that her life depended on reaching the street before the operatives could catch her. Her years of physical labor had kept her in reasonable shape, but she was fighting exhaustion by the 20th floor and gasping for breath by the 10th dot. The sound of pursuit echoed through the stairwell above her. The operatives were younger and in better physical condition, but Dorothy had a crucial advantage. She knew every level of the building from her years of cleaning it. On the 15th floor, she exited the stairwell and ran through the offices of a law firm, using her master keycard to access areas her pursuers couldn't enter without breaking down doors. The law firm's offices connected to a different stairwell on the opposite side of the building, buying Dorothy precious time as the operatives realized they had lost her trail. She used this advantage to make it to the parking garage, where her 15-year-old Honda Civic waited in its usual spot near the employee entrance. The engine turned over on the first try, a miracle she would thank God for later, and Dorothy gunned it toward the garage exit just as she saw the operatives emerging from the building's main entrance. What followed was a heart-stopping chase through downtown Chicago's evening traffic, with Dorothy using every shortcut and back alley she had learned during her years of commuting to the city. Her old Honda was no match for the powerful SUV that pursued her through the streets, but Dorothy had grown up in Chicago and knew the city's traffic patterns better than her pursuers. She managed to lose them by turning into a shopping mall parking lot and hiding her car behind a delivery truck, then waiting in the shadows for over an hour to make sure she hadn't been followed. As she sat in her car, shaking from adrenaline and fear, Dorothy realized that her old life was over. She could never return to her apartment, her job, or any aspect of her normal routine. The conspirators now knew that she had discovered their secret, and they would never stop hunting her. More importantly, she had perhaps 36 hours to prevent the assassination of the French president, and she was now a fugitive with limited resources and no clear plan. Using a payphone at the shopping mall, Dorothy made the most difficult call of her life. She contacted her daughter Jessica at Northwestern University and told her to immediately go to the campus security office and request protective custody. "Don't ask questions," Dorothy said, fighting back tears. "Just tell them your mother is a federal witness and that both your lives are in danger. Someone will come for you within the hour." Dorothy then called her husband Thomas at the auto shop where he worked. "The man you married doesn't exist anymore," she told him cryptically, using a code phrase they had agreed upon years earlier for extreme emergencies. "Take our emergency fund and go to your brother's cabin in Wisconsin. Don't tell anyone where you're going, and don't contact me until I contact you." As Dorothy hung up the phone, she realized that in trying to save 3 world leaders, she had lost everything that mattered to her. But she also knew that she was the only person who could prevent a catastrophe that would reshape global politics and potentially trigger international conflicts. The French president was going to die in less than 2 days unless Dorothy Cooper, a cleaning lady from Rogers Park, could find a way to stop the most sophisticated assassination conspiracy in modern history. The hunter had become the hunted, but Dorothy was far from defeated. She had advantages that the conspirators couldn't anticipate, knowledge they didn't know she possessed, and a determination that came from understanding exactly what was at stake. The real battle was just beginning. Dorothy returned to work the following evening with a knot of anxiety in her stomach. She had spent the day researching methods of anonymous communication and secure document transmission, learning about encrypted email services and digital dead drops from library computers. What she had discovered was both encouraging and terrifying. There were ways to safely transmit sensitive information to authorities, but they required technical expertise she didn't possess, and time she wasn't sure she had. As she badged into Meridian Tower, Dorothy noticed something that made her blood run cold. Marcus Henderson's Bentley was still in the executive parking garage. along with 2 other luxury vehicles she recognized as belonging to David Morrison and Sarah Chen. It was nearly 7 p.m., well past the time when the executive staff normally departed. Either they were working unusually late, or they had discovered that their operation had been compromised. Dorothy's hands trembled as she entered the elevator. She had prepared herself for this possibility, but she hadn't expected it to happen so soon. If the conspirators knew that someone had accessed their documents, her life was in immediate danger. But she also knew that acting suspiciously now would only confirm their suspicions. She had to maintain her normal routine while being prepared to run at the first sign of trouble. The 48th floor was buzzing with activity that Dorothy had never seen during her evening shifts. Several men in expensive suits were moving through the offices, conducting what appeared to be a systematic search of every room. They weren't Henderson Global employees. Their body language and the way they moved through the space suggested they were professional security operatives, possibly former military or intelligence personnel. Dorothy forced herself to remain calm as she wheeled her cleaning cart toward the reception area. One of the operatives glanced at her briefly before returning to his search of the filing cabinets. To him, she was just the cleaning lady, as invisible and harmless as she had always been. But Dorothy could see that they were looking for something specific, and she suspected that something was evidence of who had accessed the Trinity Protocol documents. As she began her cleaning routine, Dorothy positioned herself where she could observe the activity in Henderson's office. Through the glass walls, she could see Henderson himself directing the search while speaking in urgent tones on his secure phone. His normally composed demeanor had been replaced by barely controlled anxiety, and Dorothy realized at her worst. Fears were being confirmed. They knew someone had discovered their secret. The search was methodical and professional. The operatives were checking not just for missing documents, but for any sign that someone had been where they shouldn't have been. Dorothy watched with growing dread as one of them examined the wastebasket where she had found the Trinity Protocol folder. They were looking for fingerprints, displaced items, anything that might indicate unauthorized access. Dorothy's heart nearly stopped when she saw Sarah Chun enter Henderson's office carrying what appeared to be security camera footage. They were reviewing the recordings from the previous evening, looking for any anomalous behavior that might indicate who had compromised their operation. Dorothy realized she had perhaps an hour, maybe less, before they identified her as the person who had spent too much time in Henderson's office. Working with desperate efficiency, Dorothy began implementing the emergency plan she had developed during her day of research. She moved her cleaning cart to the supply closet, where she had hidden a small bag containing the smartphone with the photographed documents, some cash, and a change of clothes. If she was going to survive the next few hours, she needed to disappear before the conspirators connected her to their security breach. But as Dorothy prepared to leave the building, she overheard a conversation that changed everything. Henderson was speaking to someone on his secure phone, and his words carried clearly through the glass walls of his office. Move up the timeline. If someone knows about Trinity, we can't wait until December. The French president needs to be eliminated within 48 hours. The revelation hit Dorothy like a physical blow. By discovering their conspiracy, she had inadvertently triggered an acceleration of their assassination schedule. Instead of having 3 weeks to expose the plot, she now had less than 2 days. French President Marie Dubois was going to die this weekend unless Dorothy could find a way to warn her. Dorothy's mind raced as she considered her options. She could try to contact the French embassy or the Secret Service, but she had no way to verify that those institutions hadn't been infiltrated by the syndicate. She could attempt to reach out to international media, but convincing journalists that she had stumbled upon evidence of an international assassination conspiracy would take time she didn't have. Most critically, she didn't know the specific details of the accelerated assassination plan only. that it was happening much sooner than originally scheduled. As these thoughts consumed her attention, Dorothy failed to notice that one of the security operatives had been watching her. When she looked up from her cleaning cart, she found herself face to face with a man whose cold eyes suggested he was accustomed to violence. "Excuse me," he said in a voice that was polite but carried an unmistakable threat. "Mr. Henderson would like to speak with you." Dorothy's survival instincts kicked in. She had spent 12 years observing dangerous people, and she knew that this conversation would not end well for her. "Of course," she replied, forcing her voice to remain steady. "Let me just finish with this trash bin." As she bent down to empty the wastebasket, Dorothy palmed the small canister of industrial strength cleaning solvent she always carried, the same substance that had saved her predecessor at Pinnacle Shooting Club years earlier. When the operative moved closer, clearly intending to escort her to Henderson's office, Dorothy acted. She sprayed the cleaning solvent directly into his eyes, causing him to cry out and stumble backward. In the confusion, she grabbed her hidden bag from the supply closet and ran toward the emergency stairwell, knowing that the elevators would be too slow and too easily controlled by the conspirators. Behind her, Dorothy could hear shouting and the sound of feet pounding across the office floor. The emergency alarm began blaring as she pushed through the stairwell door, but she knew the building's security protocols worked in her favor in an emergency. All elevators would shut down, forcing anyone pursuing her to use the stairs as well. 48 floors had never seemed so far. Dorothy's legs burned as she took the stairs 2 at a time, driven by adrenaline and the knowledge that her life depended on reaching the street before the operatives could catch her. Her years of physical labor had kept her in reasonable shape, but she was fighting exhaustion by the 20th floor and gasping for breath by the 10th. The sound of pursuit echoed through the stairwell above her. The operatives were younger and in better physical condition, but Dorothy had a crucial advantage. She knew every level of the building from her years of cleaning it. On the 10th floor, she exited the stairwell and ran through the offices of a law firm. Using her master keycard to access areas her pursuers couldn't enter without breaking down doors, the law firm's offices connected to a different stairwell on the opposite side of the building, buying Dorothy precious time as the operatives realized they had lost her trail. She used this advantage to make it to the parking garage, where her 15-year-old Honda Civic waited in its usual spot near the employee entrance. The engine turned over on the first try, miracle she would thank God for later, and Dorothy gunned it toward the garage exit just as she saw the operatives emerging from the building's main entrance. What followed was a heart-stopping chase through downtown Chicago's evening traffic, with Dorothy using every shortcut and back alley she had learned during her years of commuting to the city. Her old Honda was no match for the powerful SUV that pursued her through the streets, but Dorothy had grown up in Chicago and knew the city's traffic patterns better than her pursuers. She managed to lose them by turning into a shopping mall parking lot and hiding her car behind a delivery truck, then waiting in the shadows for over an hour to make sure she hadn't been followed. As she sat in her car, shaking from adrenaline and fear, Dorothy realized that her old life was over. She could never return to her apartment, her job, or any aspect of her normal routine. The conspirators now knew that she had discovered their secret, and they would never stop hunting her. More importantly, she had perhaps 36 hours to prevent the assassination of the French president, and she was now a fugitive with limited resources and no clear plan. Using a payphone at the shopping mall, Dorothy made the most difficult call of her life. She contacted her daughter Jessica at Northwestern University and told her to immediately go to the campus security office and request protective custody. "Don't ask questions," Dorothy said, fighting back tears. "Just tell them your mother is a federal witness and that both your lives are in danger. Someone will come for you within the hour." Dorothy then called her husband Thomas at the auto shop where he worked. "The man you married doesn't exist anymore," she told him cryptically, using a code phrase they had agreed upon years earlier for extreme emergencies. Take our emergency fund and go to your brother's cabin in Wisconsin. Don't tell anyone where you're going, and don't contact me until I contact you. As Dorothy hung up the phone, she realized that in trying to save 3 world leaders, she had lost everything that mattered to her. But she also knew that she was the only person who could prevent a catastrophe that would reshape global politics and potentially trigger international conflicts. The French president was going to die in less than 2 days unless Dorothy Cooper, a cleaning lady from Rogers Park, could find a way to stop the most sophisticated assassination conspiracy in modern history. The hunter had become the hunted, but Dorothy was far from defeated. She had advantages that the conspirators couldn't anticipate, knowledge they didn't know she possessed, and a determination that came from understanding exactly what was at stake. The real battle was just beginning. Dorothy spent the night in her car at a 24-hour truck stop outside Aurora, Illinois, trying to formulate a plan that seemed increasingly impossible. She had less than 36 hours to prevent an assassination, but she was a fugitive with no allies, limited resources, and enemies, who commanded virtually unlimited power. Every hour that passed brought French President Marie Dubois closer to her death, and Dorothy was no closer to finding a way to save her. The truck stop's fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as Dorothy hunched over her smartphone, desperately searching for any information about the French president's accelerated schedule. The official diplomatic channels showed no change to the December 8 UN Security Council address, which meant the assassination plot was operating completely outside normal diplomatic protocols. The conspirators had found a way to create an opportunity to kill the French president without leaving any public trace of her presence in the United States. As dawn broke over the Illinois prairie, Dorothy made a decision that would define everything that followed. She couldn't expose the conspiracy through normal channels. There wasn't enough time, and she couldn't trust that any government agency was free from syndicate infiltration. But she could try to reach the French president directly and warn her about the immediate threat to her life. Dorothy's first challenge was determining where President Dubois actually was. The official French government website showed her scheduled to be in Paris for the rest of the week, but Dorothy knew that was diplomatic misdirection. If the syndicate was planning to assassinate her within the next day, she had to be somewhere in the United States already, probably under heavy security at a location known only to her inner circle, using free Wi-Fi at a McDonald's in Naperville. Dorothy began what she later described as the most intensive research project of her life. She scoured diplomatic press releases, flight tracking websites, and international news sources for any hint of the French president's actual location. The breakthrough came when she found a small item in the Chicago Tribune's business section about increased security at the Drake Hotel downtown, security that was described as preparations for an unspecified diplomatic event. The Drake Hotel was exactly the kind of venue that would be used for a clandestine diplomatic meeting. It was prestigious enough to host world leaders but private enough to avoid the media attention that would surround an official state visit. If President Dubois was in Chicago for a secret meeting with American officials, the Drake would be the perfect location. Dorothy's heart raced as she realized the implication. The French president was probably less than 50 miles away from where Dorothy sat, unaware that she was walking into an assassination trap that had been years in the planning. But knowing the president's approximate location didn't solve Dorothy's fundamental problem. How could a fugitive cleaning lady reach one of the most protected people in the world? The answer came from an unexpected source. As Dorothy researched the hotel's layout and security arrangements, she remembered something her daughter Jessica had told her about her journalism classes. Jessica had interviewed several hotel workers for a project about labor conditions in the hospitality industry, and she had mentioned that hotels relied heavily on temporary staffing agencies during major events. If the Drake was hosting a diplomatic event, They would need additional housekeeping staff, and temporary workers were always the least scrutinized employees. Dorothy drove back toward Chicago, stopping at a thrift store to purchase clothing that would help her blend in as a hotel worker. She bought a simple black dress, sensible shoes, and a cardigan that looked professional but unremarkable. At a drugstore, she purchased hair dye to change her appearance and makeup to make herself look older and more worn down. The transformation wasn't dramatic, but it was enough to ensure that anyone looking for Dorothy Cooper wouldn't immediately recognize the tired-looking middle-aged woman who emerged from the drugstore. Bathroom. The Windy City Staffing Agency operated out of a strip mall on Chicago's north side, specializing in providing temporary workers for hotels, restaurants, and catering companies. Dorothy had researched the company online and learned that they frequently supplied staff to high-end hotels for special events. More importantly, their hiring process was notoriously lax. They needed workers immediately and asked few questions about backgrounds or qualifications. Dorothy walked into the agency office with a confidence she didn't feel, armed with a false name and a fabricated work history that she had memorized during the drive into the city. She told the receptionist that she was Margaret Williams, a recently divorced mother who needed immediate employment to support her children. The receptionist, overwhelmed by calls for temporary staff, barely glanced at Dorothy's hastily constructed resume before assigning her to a housekeeping shift at the Drake Hotel starting that afternoon. "You'll be working a double shift," the receptionist explained. "Some big diplomatic thing is happening, so they need extra security and extra cleaning staff. Pay is time and a half, but you'll be working under strict confidentiality agreements. Whatever you see or hear, you don't talk about it. Understood?" Dorothy nodded, understanding far more than the receptionist could have imagined. The confidentiality agreements confirmed that something significant was happening at the Drake, and the mention of extra security suggested that very important people were involved. She was walking into exactly the situation she had hoped to find. The Drake Hotel's staff entrance was a maze of service corridors and loading docks designed to keep the army of workers invisible to the hotel's wealthy guests. Dorothy reported to the housekeeping supervisor, a harried woman named Linda Peterson, who was dealing with the stress of preparing for what she described as the most important event in the hotel's history. "You'll be assigned to the 14th floor," Peterson explained, handing Dorothy a master keycard and a cart loaded with cleaning supplies. "That's where our VIP guests are staying. You don't speak to the guests, you don't ask questions, and you definitely don't take any pictures. The security people will be watching everything, so just do your job and stay invisible." Dorothy almost smiled at the irony. Staying invisible was exactly what she intended to do, but for reasons Peterson couldn't imagine. As she wheeled her cart toward the service elevator, Dorothy felt the familiar weight of cleaning supplies and the comforting anonymity of a uniform that made her part of the hotel's infrastructure rather than a person of interest. The 14th floor was unlike anything Dorothy had ever seen. Secret Service agents stood at both ends of the hallway, and every door was monitored by sophisticated security equipment. The carpet had been replaced with materials that would reveal footprints, and Dorothy noticed small cameras disguised as fire detectors monitoring every movement in the corridor. This wasn't just VIP security. This was presidential-level protection. As Dorothy began her cleaning routine, she overheard fragments of conversation that confirmed her worst fears. French security personnel were discussing schedule changes and route modifications, while American agents coordinated with local law enforcement about perimeter security. President Dubois was indeed in the building, and she was scheduled to attend a secret meeting that evening with senior American officials. The meeting was supposed to be completely off the books, a private discussion about trade policy and climate change initiatives that would avoid the media attention of an official state visit. It was exactly the kind of informal diplomatic engagement that the syndicate could exploit. creating an opportunity to assassinate the French president without the extensive security protocols that would surround an official diplomatic event. Dorothy's opportunity came when she overheard two Secret Service agents discussing a security briefing scheduled for 6 p.m. in the hotel's executive conference room. The agents would be reviewing threat assessments and security protocols for the evening's meeting, which meant they would have detailed information about the president's schedule and security arrangements. If Dorothy could access that briefing, she might learn enough about the assassination plot to prevent it. But infiltrating a Secret Service security briefing was far beyond anything Dorothy had ever attempted. These were professionals trained to detect threats and suspicious behavior, and they would be especially vigilant given the sensitivity of the president's visit. Dorothy would need to find a way to observe the briefing without being detected, and she would need to do it in a way that allowed her to warn the appropriate authorities without exposing herself to retaliation from the syndicate. As Dorothy worked her way through the 14th floor, she began to understand the layout of the hotel's security arrangements. The French president was staying in the penthouse suite, which was accessible only through a private elevator that required special clearance. Her security detail occupied the entire 14th floor, with backup teams positioned on the floors above and below. The evening's meeting would take place in a secure conference room on the hotel's mezzanine level, which had been swept for surveillance devices and secured by both French and American security personnel. The sophistication of the security arrangements made Dorothy realize just how professional the syndicate's assassination plot must be. These weren't amateur terrorists or lone gunmen. They were dealing with security protocols designed to protect world leaders from the most sophisticated threats imaginable. The fact that the syndicate believed they could successfully carry out an assassination in this environment suggested they had inside information about the security arrangements and perhaps even infiltrators within the protection details themselves. As the afternoon progressed, Dorothy noticed subtle signs that concerned her. Several hotel staff members were asking questions about the security arrangements that seemed to go beyond normal curiosity. A maintenance worker was spending an unusual amount of time inspecting air vents and electrical systems near the conference room where the evening's meeting would take place. Most disturbing of all, Dorothy recognized one of the temporary security guards from her research into the syndicate. He was Robert Mitchell, a former CIA operative whose photograph had appeared in the Henderson Global files. Dorothy realized that the assassination plot was already in motion. The syndicate had infiltrated the hotel's staff and security arrangements, positioning their operatives throughout the building. President Dubois was walking into a trap that had been carefully prepared by people who understood exactly how to exploit the weaknesses in even the most sophisticated security protocols. With less than 4 hours until the president's scheduled meeting, Dorothy faced the most difficult decision of her life. She could try to warn the Secret Service about the infiltration, but doing so would expose her own presence and potentially trigger a security lockdown that might actually help the assassins by creating confusion and disrupting established protocols. Alternatively, she could try to identify and neutralize the syndicate operatives herself, but she was one person facing a conspiracy that had been years in the planning. As Dorothy stood in a hotel service corridor, surrounded by the invisible army of workers who kept the Drake running, she realized that she was about to attempt something that would have been impossible for any government agent or security professional. She was going to save the life of the French president using nothing but her wits, her knowledge of how invisible people navigate powerful institutions, and her determination to prevent a catastrophe that would reshape international politics. The clock was ticking, and Dorothy Cooper was running out of time. Dorothy had 3 hours to prevent an assassination, and she was surrounded by killers who thought she was just another hotel worker. As she moved through the Drake's service corridors with her cleaning cart, she began to identify the full scope of the syndicate's infiltration. What she discovered was a masterpiece of operational planning that had taken months to put into place. The syndicate hadn't just placed operatives among the hotel staff, they had systematically replaced key personnel in positions that would give them access to President Dubois. The head of catering was actually Elena Vasquez, a former NS contractor whose real name Dorothy had seen in the Henderson Global files. The assistant security chief was Paul Henderson, no relation to Marcus, but another former intelligence operative now working for the conspiracy. Even the hotel's florist had been replaced by someone whose background check would have revealed connections to international arms dealers. Dorothy's years of observing powerful people had taught her to read the subtle signs of deception and coordination. As she watched the hotel staff prepare for the evening's diplomatic meeting, she could see the invisible communication network that connected the syndicate operatives. A glance between the catering manager and a maintenance worker. A brief hand signal from a security guard to someone monitoring the elevators. These people were coordinating their activities with military precision, and they were completely unaware that a cleaning lady was documenting their every move. The assassination plan was elegant in its simplicity. President Dubois would arrive at the hotel through the main entrance, where she would be greeted by legitimate hotel management and escorted to the secure conference room for her meeting with American officials. The room had been thoroughly swept for surveillance devices and explosive materials by both French and American security teams. Every person who would have access to the president had been vetted through multiple intelligence databases. By every conventional security standard, the meeting was as safe as humanly possible, but the syndicate had found a vulnerability that no security protocol could address. They had replaced the very people responsible for implementing those protocols. Elena Vasquez would personally serve refreshments to the president, giving her direct access with a tray that could conceal a weapon or poison. Paul Henderson would be monitoring the security cameras, allowing him to create blind spots or disable alarms at crucial moments. The florist had delivered arrangements that could conceal listening devices or small explosive charges. Dorothy realized that the assassination wouldn't happen during the meeting itself. It would occur during the carefully orchestrated chaos that would follow the president's arrival. The syndicate operatives would create a security incident that would require the president to be evacuated through routes they controlled, giving them multiple opportunities to eliminate her while making it appear that she had been killed by terrorists or foreign agents seeking to disrupt American-French relations. As Dorothy absorbed the full implications of what she was observing, she faced a terrible realization. She couldn't simply warn the Secret Service about the plot. The syndicate's infiltration was so complete that any warning she gave might reach the very people who were planning to kill the president. Even if she could identify herself to legitimate agents, the resulting security lockdown might actually trigger the assassination by forcing the president into the evacuation scenarios the conspirators had prepared. Dorothy needed a different approach, one that would neutralize the syndicate operatives without alerting them that their plot had been discovered. She had to think like the invisible person she had always been, finding ways to disrupt their coordination without revealing her own involvement. It was the most complex chess game imaginable, and she was playing against grandmasters with stakes that couldn't be higher. Her first move was subtle but potentially devastating to the conspiracy's timeline. While cleaning the executive conference room where the meeting would take place, Dorothy accidentally spilled cleaning solution on the room's sophisticated communication equipment. The damage wouldn't be immediately apparent, but it would prevent the syndicate operatives from coordinating their activities through the hotel's internal systems. They would have to rely on backup communication methods that would be less secure and more easily monitored by legitimate security personnel. Dorothy's second intervention was more direct. She had noticed that Elena Vasquez was preparing a special serving tray for the president, one that was kept separate from the regular catering supplies and handled with unusual care. While Vasquez was distracted by a phone call, Dorothy managed to examine the tray and discovered a hidden compartment containing what appeared to be a small, injectable device disguised as a decorative element. Dorothy carefully disabled the device by removing a crucial component, making it appear that the mechanism had simply malfunctioned. The most dangerous part of Dorothy's plan involved neutralizing Paul Henderson's control over the security camera system. Henderson was monitoring the feeds from a secure control room that required special clearance to access. But Dorothy had noticed that the room's ventilation system connected to a maintenance area that she could reach through the hotel's service corridors. Using knowledge gained from 12 years of cleaning similar buildings, Dorothy accessed the ventilation system and introduced cleaning chemicals that would gradually fog the camera lenses, creating the blind spots that Henderson was supposed to create for his fellow conspirators, but doing so in a way that would alert legitimate security personnel to technical problems. As Dorothy worked to systematically disrupt the syndicate's coordination, she began to notice signs that her activities might have been detected. Robert Mitchell, the former CIA operative she had recognized earlier, was spending an unusual amount of time in areas where she had recently been working. When she passed him in the corridor, he studied her face with the intensity of someone trying to place a familiar but unexpected presence. Dorothy realized that her 12-year career of invisibility might be coming to an end at the worst possible moment. The situation became critical when Dorothy overheard a radio communication between Mitchell and someone he addressed as Control. Mitchell was reporting anomalous maintenance activities and requesting permission to conduct a more thorough security sweep of the hotel staff. If the syndicate operatives began scrutinizing the temporary workers, Dorothy's false identity wouldn't survive. Even cursory investigation. Dorothy made a desperate decision that would either save the president's life or get them both killed. Instead of continuing her covert disruption of the assassination plot, she would try to make direct contact with the French security detail and warn them about the specific threats she had identified. It was an enormous risk. The French agents had no reason to trust a hotel worker claiming to have discovered an international assassination conspiracy, and approaching them would immediately expose Dorothy to retaliation from the syndicate operatives. But Dorothy had one advantage that the conspirators couldn't anticipate. She had concrete evidence of their infiltration. She had photographed the hidden device in the catering tray, documented the replaced hotel personnel, and recorded the radio communications between Mitchell and his handlers. More importantly, she could provide specific details about the assassination plan that no outsider should have been able to discover. As President Dubois's arrival time approached, Dorothy positioned herself in a service area adjacent to the hotel's main elevator bank, where she knew the French security detail would pass. During their final preparations, she had rehearsed exactly what she would say and how she would say it, understanding that she would have perhaps 30 seconds to convince highly trained security professionals that a cleaning lady had uncovered a plot that their own intelligence services had missed. The French security team was led by Colonel Philippe Moreau, a career military officer whose reputation for protecting high-profile targets was legendary among international security professionals. Moreau was conducting the final walkthrough of the president's route when Dorothy stepped out of the service area and approached him with the kind of calm confidence that only comes from absolute certainty about the rightness of one's actions. "Colonel Moreau," she said in carefully practiced French, "I am Dorothy Cooper, and I have information about an immediate threat to President Dubois's life." She held up her smartphone, showing him the photograph she had taken of the hidden device and the syndicate operatives. "These people have infiltrated your security arrangements, and they plan to kill the president during her evacuation from a staged security incident." Moreau's hand moved instinctively toward his weapon as his training kicked in, but something about Dorothy's demeanor, the complete absence of nervousness or deception that comes from telling the absolute truth under impossible circumstances, made him pause. Instead of immediately calling for backup or treating her as a potential threat, he listened as Dorothy rapidly explained what she had discovered and how she had come to possess information that should have been impossible for a hotel worker to obtain. The colonel's expression changed as Dorothy provided details that only someone with intimate knowledge of the assassination plot could have known. She described the specific roles of each syndicate operative, the technical specifications of their equipment, and most convincingly, the exact timeline for the staged security incident that would provide cover for the president's murder. By the time Dorothy finished her rapid briefing, Moreau understood that he was dealing with either the most sophisticated disinformation campaign in intelligence history or a genuine threat that had somehow been detected by the most unlikely witness imaginable. "Madame Cooper," Moreau said in accented but perfect English, "if what you're telling me is true, you may have prevented the most significant assassination attempt since World War II. But if you're wrong, or if this is some kind of deception, you understand that you've just confessed to conducting surveillance on the President of France." Dorothy met his gaze without flinching. "Colonel, I'm a cleaning lady from Chicago who discovered plans to murder 3 world leaders. I didn't ask for this responsibility, but I'm not going to walk away from it. President Dubois will die tonight, unless you act on what I've told you." As if summoned by her words, Robert Mitchell appeared at the end of the corridor, his expression showing that he had finally recognized Dorothy as the Henderson Global cleaning lady who had somehow escaped their Chicago operation. The moment of truth had arrived, and Dorothy realized that the next few minutes would determine whether she had saved a life or merely delayed an inevitable tragedy. The corridor erupted into chaos as Robert Mitchell's recognition of Dorothy triggered a cascade of events that none of the participants had fully anticipated. Mitchell's hand moved toward his concealed weapon, but Colonel Moreau's years of combat experience gave him a split-second advantage. The French security chief stepped between Dorothy and Mitchell while simultaneously signaling his backup team. Through a hand gesture that Dorothy couldn't see but whose meaning was unmistakable, "Potential hostile, weapons free." "Step back," Moreau commanded Mitchell in English, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to life-and-death decisions. "Identify yourself and state your business in this restricted area." Mitchell's tactical training told him to de-escalate, but his orders from the syndicate were clear: eliminate any threats to the operation, regardless of collateral damage. The moment stretched like a taut wire as Mitchell calculated his options. He could try to bluff his way past the French security team, but Dorothy's presence had already compromised that possibility. He could attempt to eliminate both Dorothy and Moreau, but the corridor was crawling with armed agents who would respond instantly to gunfire. Dorothy watched this deadly chess match unfold with the strange clarity that comes from understanding that your next words might determine whether you live or die. "Colonel," she said quietly, "the man facing you is Robert Mitchell, former CIA operative, now working for the group planning to assassinate President Dubois. Check your security database. His photo is in the Henderson Global files I mentioned." Moreau's earpiece crackled as his intelligence team ran Mitchell's image through their facial recognition systems. Within seconds, they had confirmation: Robert Mitchell, terminated from CIA employment 3 years earlier for unauthorized contact with foreign agents, currently wanted for questioning in connection with arms trafficking operations in Eastern Europe. The man standing 15 feet away was exactly who Dorothy claimed he was. The revelation transformed the situation from a potential misunderstanding into an active security crisis. Mitchell realized that his cover was blown and that his only chance of completing the mission was to eliminate the witnesses and create enough chaos to trigger the evacuation scenarios the syndicate had prepared. But as he reached for his weapon, Dorothy did something that surprised everyone, including herself. Instead of seeking cover or waiting for the professionals to handle the situation, Dorothy stepped forward and began speaking rapidly in French words. She had memorized from her daughter's college textbooks during her frantic preparation for this moment. "Colonel, the assassination will happen during the evacuation. They want you to move the president through the service corridors where they have positioned their people. The safe route is compromised." Mitchell's weapon was halfway out of his jacket when two French security agents materialized behind him, their own guns drawn and aimed at center mass. The tactical situation had shifted completely. Mitchell was outnumbered, outgunned, and facing professionals who had spent their careers protecting high-value targets from exactly this kind of threat. "Drop your weapon," one of the French agents commanded. "Keep your hands visible and step away from the wall." But Mitchell had made a calculation that Dorothy couldn't have anticipated. Instead of surrendering, he activated a small device on his belter radio transmitter that sent a predetermined signal to the other syndicate operatives throughout the hotel. It was the signal for Operation Compromised. Execute emergency protocols. Suddenly, the Drake Hotel became a battlefield. Elena Vasquez abandoned her catering station and moved toward the conference room where President Dubois was scheduled to arrive in 20 minutes. Paul Henderson began implementing the security lockdown procedures that would force the president into the exact evacuation routes the conspirators had prepared. Throughout the building, syndicate operatives began moving toward their assigned positions for what they now knew would be their only chance to complete the assassination. Dorothy found herself at the center of a security crisis that was unfolding exactly as she had warned it would, but faster and more violently than anyone had expected. Colonel Moreau was speaking rapidly into his radio, coordinating with both French and American security teams to implement emergency protocols while simultaneously trying to locate and neutralize the infiltrators Dorothy had identified. "Madame Cooper," Moreau said as his team secured Mitchell, "I need you to tell me everything you know about their positions and their backup plans. We have perhaps 10 minutes before this situation becomes uncontrollable." Dorothy's mind raced as she tried to remember every detail from the Henderson Global documents and her observations throughout the day. Elena Vasquez is moving toward the conference room. She has access to the president's refreshments, and she's trained in close-quarters elimination. Paul Henderson controls the security cameras and the lockdown protocols. He can trap the president in any room in the building. There's also a maintenance worker named Carlos Rodriguez, who has been mapping the building's structural weaknesses. I think they have explosives placed as a backup plan. As if summoned by her words, the hotel's fire alarm system began blaring throughout the building. It wasn't a drill or a malfunction. Someone had deliberately triggered the emergency evacuation protocols that would empty the building and create the chaos the syndicate needed to complete their mission. Dorothy realized that this was the moment she had been dreading. The conspirators were implementing their final gambit, and President Dubois would arrive at the hotel just as the building was being evacuated. Moreau's earpiece erupted with radio traffic as security teams throughout the building reported multiple suspicious activities occurring simultaneously. The hotel's main elevators had been disabled from the security control room. Explosive devices had been detected in the parking garage. Armed individuals had been spotted on multiple floors, and the building's communication systems were experiencing systematic failures. "They're trying to force us into the evacuation protocols," Dorothy said, her voice cutting through the chaos. "Once the president arrives, they'll claim there's a bomb threat or a terrorist attack. During the evacuation, they'll have multiple opportunities to eliminate her while making it look like she was killed by the very threats they're creating." Moreau made a decision that would later be studied in security academies around the world. Instead of following standard evacuation procedures, he ordered his team to implement what he called fortress protocols. They would secure the president in the most defensible location in the building and eliminate the threats one by one, rather than moving her through areas that might be compromised. But as Moreau coordinated his response to the unfolding crisis, Dorothy noticed something that filled her with dread. Through the corridor's windows, she could see the distinctive armored limousine that transported President Dubois, pulling up to the hotel's main entrance. The president was arriving exactly on schedule, unaware that she was walking into a building where assassins were implementing the final phase of a conspiracy that had been years in the planning. "Colonel," Dorothy said urgently. "She's here. President Dubois just arrived." The next few minutes unfolded with the terrible clarity of a slow-motion disaster. President Dubois entered the Drake Hotel through the main entrance, where she was greeted by what appeared to be normal hotel management and security personnel. Her French security detail had maintained radio contact with Moreau's team, but the hotel's communication systems were being systematically jammed by the syndicate operatives, making coordination increasingly difficult. Dorothy watched through security monitors as Elena Vasquez approached the president with a serving tray containing what Dorothy knew was a concealed weapon. Paul Henderson was manually overriding security cameras to create blind spots in the president's route. Most ominously, Carlos Rodriguez was moving through the building's service areas with what appeared to be remote detonation equipment. "We have to stop them now," Dorothy said, but she realized that Moreau and his team were already overwhelmed by the complexity of the threat they were facing. The syndicate had planned for every contingency, including the possibility that their infiltration might be detected. They had backup plans for their backup plans, and they were implementing all of them simultaneously. That's when Dorothy made the decision that would transform her from a witness to an active participant in preventing one of the most significant assassinations in modern history. She couldn't rely on the security professionals to neutralize every threat. There were too many moving parts, too many variables, and too little time. But she could use her knowledge of the building and her 12 years of experience moving invisibly through secured spaces to directly intervene in the assassination attempts. "Colonel," she said, "I'm going after Elena Vasquez. She's the immediate threat to the president, and I'm the only person who can get close to her without triggering additional security responses." Moreau looked at Dorothy with a mixture of admiration and concern. "Madame Cooper, you're not trained for this kind of operation. These people are professional killers." Dorothy met his gaze with the calm determination that had carried her through 12 years of invisible service and 3 days of unimaginable danger. "Colonel, I've been invisible to these people for my entire career. They don't see me as a threat because they don't see me at all. That's my advantage." As Dorothy moved toward the elevator that would take her to the conference level where President Dubois was walking into an assassination trap, she realized that she was about to attempt something that would have been impossible for any trained agent or security professional. She was going to save the life of a world leader using nothing but her wits, her knowledge of how powerful institutions actually work, and her lifetime of experience being underestimated by people who believed that invisible workers don't matter. The elevator doors closed behind her, and Dorothy Cooper began her descent into the most dangerous few minutes of her life, knowing that the fate of international politics might depend on whether a cleaning lady from Chicago could outmaneuver some of the most sophisticated killers in the world. The elevator descended through the heart of the Drake Hotel as Dorothy Cooper prepared for the most important moments of her life. Above her, she could hear the muffled sounds of gunfire and shouting as Colonel Moreau's team engaged with syndicate operatives throughout the building. Below her, French President Marie Dubois was walking into a conference room where Elena Vasquez waited with a serving tray that concealed death itself. Dorothy had perhaps 3 minutes before Elena would have her opportunity to strike. The president's security detail was focused on external threats, bomb scares, armed infiltrators, and the chaos erupting throughout the hotel. They weren't watching for a catering supervisor who had been vetted through multiple security databases and cleared for direct contact with the president. Elena's position was perfect, and her window of opportunity was opening exactly as the syndicate had planned. The elevator doors opened onto the mezzanine level, and Dorothy stepped into a corridor that buzzed with the controlled urgency of a diplomatic event under siege. Secret Service agents were repositioning to respond to threats throughout the building, while French security personnel maintained their protective formation around the conference room where President Dubois was beginning her private meeting. With American officials, Dorothy could see Elena Vasquez through the conference room's glass doors, moving with professional efficiency as she arranged refreshments for the president and her guests. To everyone watching, Elena appeared to be exactly what she claimed to be, a senior catering supervisor, ensuring that an important diplomatic meeting proceeded smoothly. Only Dorothy knew that Elena was actually positioning herself for an assassination that would be completed before anyone realized what had happened. The challenge Dorothy faced was unprecedented in the history of executive protection. How could she warn the president's security detail about an imminent assassination attempt without creating the very chaos that would give Elena her opportunity to strike? If Dorothy burst into the conference room shouting warnings, the resulting confusion would provide perfect cover for Elena to complete her mission and escape in the aftermath. Dorothy's solution came from 12 years of moving invisibly through spaces where powerful people conducted important business. She wouldn't disrupt the meeting, she would become part of it. Elena wasn't the only person in the room with a uniform and a legitimate reason to be near the president. Dorothy was also wearing hotel staff clothing, and she had the master keycard that would give her access to any area of the building. Moving with the calm confidence that came from a lifetime of being ignored by important people, Dorothy entered the conference room through a service entrance that Elena couldn't see from her position near the refreshment table. The president was engaged in an animated discussion about climate change policy with Secretary of State Jennifer Walsh and Treasury Secretary Michael Harrison. Their conversation was technical and intense, and none of them noticed a cleaning lady entering the room with the kind of quiet efficiency that characterized all good service workers. Dorothy positioned herself near the conference room's waste disposal area, where she would have a clear view of Elena's activities while maintaining the appearance of someone conducting routine maintenance. As she watched, Elena checked her watch 6:47 p.m. and began preparing to serve refreshments to the president and her guests. Dorothy could see Elena's hand move toward the concealed compartment in the serving tray, and she realized that the assassination attempt would happen within the next 60 seconds. That's when Dorothy did something that would be remembered in security textbooks for decades to come. Instead of trying to warn the president's security detail or attempting to physically stop Elena, she created what she later described as a service emergency that would force Elena to delay her assassination attempt without making it obvious that she had been detected. Dorothy accidentally triggered the conference room's fire suppression system by activating a manual override that she had noticed during her reconnaissance of the hotel. The system's water jets activated immediately, drenching the refreshment table and forcing Elena to step away from the president to avoid the cascade of water that was soaking everything in the room's northeast corner. The confusion was immediate and total. Secret Service agents rushed into the room. President Dubois was quickly moved away from the affected area, and Elena found herself separated from her target by a wall of security personnel who were responding to what appeared to be a serious fire emergency. But Dorothy wasn't finished. As Elena tried to reposition herself to regain access to the president, Dorothy intercepted her near the conference room service entrance. "Excuse me," Dorothy said in the deferential tone that characterized all her professional interactions. "I need to check your serving tray for water damage from the fire suppression system." Elena had no choice but to comply. Refusing would have appeared suspicious to the security personnel who were now watching every movement in the room. As Dorothy examined the tray, she discreetly removed the concealed injection device while appearing to check for water damage to the refreshments. Elena realized what was happening, but she couldn't react without exposing herself as something other than a legitimate catering supervisor. "The tray appears to be undamaged," Dorothy announced to the room in general, "but I recommend replacing the refreshments as a safety precaution." It was a perfectly reasonable suggestion that any conscientious hotel worker might make, and it effectively eliminated Elena's opportunity to poison the president. Elena's eyes met Dorothy's for a moment, and Dorothy saw the recognition dawn in the assassin's face. Elena understood that she had been outmaneuvered by the cleaning lady who had somehow anticipated her every move. But Elena was a professional, and she had backup plans. Dorothy watched as Elena reached for what appeared to be a phone in her pocket. But Dorothy recognized it as the same type of remote detonator she had seen Carlos Rodriguez carrying. Elena was preparing to trigger the explosive devices that the syndicate had placed throughout the building as their fallback option. If she couldn't assassinate the president quietly, she would bring down the entire hotel. Dorothy's response was instantaneous and decisive. She tackled Elena with the force of someone who had spent 12 years lifting, carrying, and moving heavy objects. The two women crashed into the refreshment table, sending glasses and plates flying as they struggled for control of the detonator. Elena was younger and had professional combat training, but Dorothy had the advantage of surprise and the desperate strength that comes from knowing that hundreds of lives depend on your actions. Secret Service agents swarmed the combatants within seconds, but not before Dorothy had managed to knock the detonator from Elena's hand and kick it away from both of them. Agent Sarah Martinez, who led President Dubois's protective detail, secured the device while her colleagues subdued Elena, who was still struggling to complete her mission even after being exposed and disarmed. "Ma'am," Agent Martinez said to Dorothy, "you need to identify yourself immediately and explain how you knew to intervene in this situation." Dorothy looked up from the floor where she was being held by two Secret Service agents, her uniform torn and her face bleeding from Elena's fingernails. But her voice was steady as she replied, "I'm Dorothy Cooper, and I've been trying to prevent this assassination for the past 3 days. Colonel Moreau of the French security detail can verify my identity and my information." The conference room erupted into controlled chaos as security teams coordinated to verify Dorothy's claims while simultaneously securing President Dubois and searching for additional threats throughout the building. Within minutes, Colonel Moreau arrived to confirm Dorothy's identity and provide context for her extraordinary intervention. President Dubois, who had watched the entire confrontation with the composed dignity that characterized her political career, approached Dorothy as the Secret Service agents helped her to her feet. "Madame Cooper," the president said in accented but perfect English, "I understand that you have risked everything to save my life. How can I ever repay such courage?" Dorothy looked at the most powerful woman in France, a person whose decisions affected millions of lives and whose survival had just been ensured by a cleaning lady from Chicago, and gave the answer that would define her legacy. "Madame President, I didn't do this for reward or recognition. I did it because it was right. In a democracy, ordinary people have an obligation to protect their leaders when those leaders are trying to protect them." The aftermath of what became known as the Drake Hotel incident unfolded with remarkable speed. Within hours, FBI and international intelligence agencies had used Dorothy's evidence to coordinate raids across multiple countries, dismantling the syndicate's network and preventing the planned assassinations of the British Prime Minister and German Chancellor. Marcus Henderson and his co-conspirators were arrested before they could implement their contingency plans, and the international investigation that followed revealed the scope of a conspiracy that had threatened to destabilize global politics. Dorothy's role in preventing these catastrophes made her an international hero, but she remained remarkably unchanged by the attention. She testified before Congress about the importance of protecting whistleblowers and ordinary citizens who witness criminal behavior. She established the Cooper Foundation for Democratic Accountability, which provided resources and protection for service workers who discovered evidence of corruption or criminal activity in their workplaces. Most importantly, Dorothy proved that in a democratic society, the most powerful force for justice often comes from the most unexpected places. Her story inspired thousands of other invisible workers to speak up when they witnessed wrongdoing, creating a network of accountability that transcended traditional law enforcement and intelligence gathering. 10 years later, Dorothy Cooper still lived in Chicago, though in a more comfortable apartment than she could have afforded on a cleaning lady's salary. She had written a book about her experience that became an international bestseller, with all proceeds going to organizations that supported working-class whistleblowers. She spoke regularly at universities and security conferences about the importance of paying attention to people who are often overlooked by powerful institutions. But perhaps the most fitting tribute to Dorothy's extraordinary courage came from President Dubois herself, who sent a handwritten letter every year on the anniversary of the Drake Hotel incident. The letter always contained the same message: "Thank you for reminding the world that heroism isn't about having special training or extraordinary abilities. It's about having the courage to act when action is required, regardless of the personal cost." Dorothy Cooper had started as an invisible cleaning lady who found a secret that could change the world. She had become something much more important, proof that in a democracy, everyone's voice matters, and sometimes the quietest voices carry the most important truths. In a world where powerful people often believe they're untouchable, Dorothy had shown that the most dangerous person to a corrupt system might be someone with a mop and bucket who knows right from wrong and isn't afraid to act on that knowledge. The woman who had once been invisible had become unforgettable, not because she sought fame or recognition, but because she had refused to stay silent when silence meant complicity. And in a democracy, that might be the most important lesson of all. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.